The biggest restaurant chain in the world wasn't killed by McDonald's. It wasn't Burger King, and it wasn't bad food. It was three things the company refused to change, because those three things were the reason people loved it in the first place. A nickel cup of coffee, a kitchen that never cut corners, and a door that never closed. Each one of them became a death sentence. It was called the Automat. A restaurant with no waiters where the food sat behind little glass doors on a wall and you fed yourself with nickels. The story starts in 1888 with a guy in Philadelphia who knew nothing about food but had a plan to sell it anyway. His name was Joseph Horn. He was 27. He had $1,000 borrowed from his widowed mother and a dream of running a lunch counter. The problem was he couldn't cook. So he put an ad in the paper looking for somebody who could. A German-born cook named Frank Hardart, who'd come up from New Orleans a couple of years before, read the ad and reportedly answered with 3 words: "I'm your man." They opened a tiny spot at 39 South 13th Street. 11 feet by 17 feet, a counter and 15 stools. Opening day was quiet, but the regulars came back. And they came back for one thing. Hardart had grown up around New Orleans coffee. The French drip method, slow and smooth, and nothing like the brown water every other lunch counter was serving. Everywhere else in the city, they were boiling coffee in a pot and tossing in eggshells to try to make it drinkable. If your coffee needs eggshells, that's a cry for help. Hardart's was so much better, it was practically a different product. They called it Gilt Edge. By 1898, they'd incorporated as the Horn and Hardart Baking Company. Business was solid, but the thing that would actually make these two famous wasn't the food, and it wasn't even the coffee. It was a machine, and it was already running on the other side of the ocean. In Berlin, in 1895, a company called Quissy Sona opened the world's first automat at the Zoological Garden. On its opening Sunday, it sold 22,000 cups of coffee and 5,400 sandwiches, a wall of little glass and chrome compartments, each one unlocked by a coin. You dropped your money in, turned a knob, and the food was yours. Frank Hardart saw the machines in person during a trip to Germany in 1901. He came home and told Horn they had to bring this to America. They ordered a full set from the manufacturer in Berlin for $30,000 and loaded it onto a ship. That ship collided with another vessel in heavy fog in the Atlantic. It sank. The first American automat went to the bottom of the ocean. They ordered a replacement. It showed up barely in time. June 9th, 1902. 818 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia, the first automat in America, opened its doors. Everything cost a nickel. A bun, a dish of beans, a fish cake, a cup of that French drip coffee. The place was beautiful. Marble floors, high ceilings, mirrors. The food came out of a wall, and nobody asked you a single question. The machine didn't care who you were. A banker or a kid who just got off a streetcar with a quarter in his pocket. Same table, same food. Nobody treated you different. In 1902, that was practically a revolution, and most people didn't even notice it was happening. They were too busy eating. By 1905, they had a second location. 1907, a third, and on July 2nd, 1912, they opened in New York at 1557 Broadway in Times Square. And with it, they set a price. 5 cents for a cup of coffee. 1 nickel. The machines were designed for that one coin, one denomination, one slot. Elegant and permanent. And once those machines were bolted into the walls of over 100 restaurants, there was no way to make them take anything else. Hold on to that. 5 cents for 38 years. That's the first thing that kills them. For now, the machine worked. It was spreading. And if you ever walked into one of those rooms, what happened next is something you can still feel in your hands. You're standing in front of the wall. The chrome frames are gleaming. Behind every little glass door is a different dish sitting there like it's in a museum case. Baked beans in a brown ceramic dish, macaroni and cheese with that golden crust, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, coconut custard pie or lemon meringue or pumpkin depending on the season, creamed spinach, Salisbury steak, chicken pot pie behind a door that fogs up from the heat inside, rice pudding with raisins, fish cakes on a Friday, because apparently even a machine with no soul still observed Lent. You pick the one you want. You drop your nickels in. That click, that small pop of the door releasing, and you reach in and take your plate. 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Your lunch is in your hands. If your grandmother ever took you, you remember this differently than an adult would. A kid standing in front of that wall didn't see a restaurant. They saw a vending machine the size of a building that was full of dessert. One woman remembers being taken by her grandmother as a special treat and ordering what she called her own version of fine dining. Peanut butter on raisin bread, chocolate milk, and a chocolate-covered cupcake. All of it made better by the fact that it came out of a tiny glass door. She said the magic wasn't the food itself. It was putting the coins in, hearing the click, reaching in and pulling out your own lunch. When you're 7 years old, that's not a restaurant. That's a ride. Other people remember the Automat as a Christmas tradition. Going to Manhattan during the holidays, standing in line at Radio City to see the famous Rockettes kick line, and then walking over to the Automat for lunch afterward. When it was freezing outside, the hot cocoa hit different. One woman said her mother always let them pick 2 things from the wall, and she always picked the same 2. Coconut custard pie and chocolate pudding, every single Christmas. One man who grew up in New York in the 50s put it simply. He said the food was fine, nothing life-changing compared to a real New York restaurant, but the process. Walking up to that wall, dropping in the coins, turning the knob, hearing that click. As a kid, he said he wouldn't dream of going anywhere else. His mom liked the coffee. He liked the doors. The coffee came from a chrome spout shaped like a dolphin's head, something they'd copied from an Italian fountain. They brewed it fresh and threw it out after 20 minutes if nobody bought it. At their peak, Horn and Hardart sold over 90 million cups a year. In the center of every Automat sat a woman in a glass booth. The nickel thrower. She wore rubber fingertips to keep the coins from slipping, and her hands were stained dark from handling thousands of nickels every shift. You'd hand her a bill, and without looking down, she'd scoop out exactly the right number of nickels and slide them across the marble in one motion. People stopped just to watch. She was the only person in the building you actually had to talk to, which, for New York, was already one person more than most people wanted. Everything ran through her hands. Behind the glass doors, kitchen workers loaded fresh food from the other side. You never saw them. A metal drum behind each column rotated, and a full plate just appeared. Like magic. That was the point. Everything was cooked fresh at a central commissary and trucked to every location before dawn. Nearly 400 items on the menu, all of them tasting exactly the same no matter which Automat you walked into. That system only worked because every restaurant was close enough to the kitchen to get the food while it was still fresh. Remember that. That's the second thing. The founders ate at what they called the sample table. The staff called it the ulcer table. Coffee was pulled from a random location for a surprise check. Nothing stayed overnight. Now here's something. The Horn and Hardart macaroni and cheese is the reason people still get into arguments about this place 50 years later, and it's because of an ingredient that sounds wrong. Canned tomatoes. And cayenne. Elbow macaroni, sharp cheddar, a can of whole tomatoes broken up by hand, butter, a pinch of cayenne, salt, no cream sauce. No fancy French cheese sauce. If you're putting canned tomatoes and cayenne in your mac and cheese, you've already told the fancy stuff to go sit in the corner. baked until the top turned golden brown and the edges got crunchy. The tomatoes break down and mix into the cheese until the whole thing turns tangy and rich in a way no cream sauce touches. The cayenne doesn't make it spicy, it just wakes everything up. They published the recipe in a newspaper ad sometime in the 60s. People clipped it out and kept it folded in kitchen drawers for years. Some families are still making it right now. If you've got a grandmother who puts tomatoes in her mac and cheese and you never understood why, now you know where she learned it. But the food was only half of what made this place matter. The other half was the room itself and who got to sit in it. By the time Joseph Horn died in 1941, the company had 157 locations across New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. At its peak, they served 800,000 people every single day. The largest restaurant chain in the world. Neil Simon called it the Maxims of the disenfranchised. Mel Brooks called it one of the greatest inventions and insane centers of paradise. During the war, the Automat became something else entirely. Over 50 locations in one city, open late, feeding soldiers on leave and swing shift workers between shifts, never asking questions about where you'd been or where you were headed next. A rhyme in the New York Sun back in 1933 put it perfectly, said the technocrat to the plutocrat to the autocrat and the democrat. Let's all go eat at the Automat. That is genuinely what it was like. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The Automat might have been the most democratic room in America. No host. No reservation. You walked through a revolving door and sat down next to whoever was already there. A banker next to a factory kid. A woman eating alone without a single sideways look, which in the 30s and 40s was a real thing. An immigrant who spoke no English could walk up to the wall, see the food behind the glass, drop in a nickel, and eat a hot meal without explaining himself to anybody. You didn't have to dress right. You didn't have to prove you belonged. The glass doors didn't care. They opened for whoever had the nickel. Colin Powell grew up in the South Bronx and talked about the Automat as one of his earliest experiences of real equality. Ruth Bader Ginsburg remembered the one on West 72nd Street. Wilson Goode, Philadelphia's first black mayor, said the Automat at 15th and Market was where the city's black political leaders organized. A nice place, he said, where African Americans could go and feel dignified. Every one of those little glass doors opened the same way for everybody. During the Depression, the Automat was warm, cheap, open late, and nobody judged you for being there. 2 nickels got baked beans, under 50 cents got you 3 meals. And if you didn't even have that, the Automat still let you sit. Lazy Susans loaded with ketchup and mustard. Free hot water, people mixed ketchup with hot water and called it lunch. Which, if you think about it, is just tomato soup with none of the steps. Nobody threw you out. In the coldest months, it was the warmest room some people had. If you had nowhere to be, you had a seat. That wasn't a policy. That was just what happened when the machine couldn't tell who had money and who didn't. And it didn't try. One man remembered his father buying lunch for the people making ketchup soup. Just walking up to the wall, putting in a handful of nickels, and handing over a real plate of food to whoever needed it. No big deal, no announcement, just something his dad did when they went. And then there were the college kids. One guy from 1959 remembered using the Automat trays as sleds. He and his friends would walk in, grab a stack of trays, take them to Central Park, and ride them down the hills in the snow. He got pneumonia. He said he still wouldn't have missed it. This is what people did before smartphones. On the other end of things, Jack Benny launched his TV show with a black tie party at the Automat, handing each guest a roll of nickels at the door. Because even in a tuxedo, you still needed the nickels. Irving Berlin wrote a song about the place from a 1932 musical set inside a restaurant modeled on the Automat. Edward Hopper painted a woman sitting alone in one at night, and it became one of the most recognized images of loneliness in American art. And in 1927, they launched the Horn and Hardart Children's Hour, a radio variety show starring kids that eventually moved to NBC and then to television. Bernadette Peters got her start on it. So did Frankie Avalon, Gregory Hines, and Rosemary Clooney. A chain that sold pie and baked beans was launching Broadway careers on the side. Try getting that kind of return on a Happy Meal. The show ran for decades, putting the Horn and Hardart name into the living rooms of families who already loved the food. If you remember any of this, hit subscribe. I dig into these every couple of weeks and they keep getting stranger. Because what happened next is the part nobody talks about, and it starts with a cup of coffee. For 38 years, Horn and Hardart coffee cost 5 cents, 1912 to 1950. Same price through 2 world wars and the entire Depression. Not because the company was generous, because the machines only took 1 coin. 1 slot. 1 denomination. They physically could not charge 6 cents. In hindsight, maybe somebody should have brought this up during the design meeting. So, they held the line, until they couldn't anymore. November 29th, 1950. Coffee doubled overnight, from a nickel to a dime. The company's own letter to stockholders called it the most important news of the year, if not in our history. In 12 months, coffee sales dropped from 70 million cups to 45 million. 25 million cups gone, and here's what makes that number sting. The diner down the block, the one getting all those lost customers. You know what it took for them to raise the price of coffee? A piece of chalk. Walk over to the board, erase 5 cents, write 6 cents, go back to work. 4 seconds. Horn and Hardart would have had to rip a machine out of a wall, ship it to a factory, have it rebuilt to accept a different coin, ship it back, bolt it in again, and do that at 150 locations to go up by 1 penny. The diner used chalk. The Automat needed an engineering project, and it wasn't just the coffee. Every other item in the Automat faced the same trap. A dish that should have cost 30 cents had to be a quarter or 35 because the machines forced everything into nickel jumps, no in between. Gregory Peck once said they made the best scrambled eggs in the world, and he'd eaten in places that charged $40 for eggs. The food was never the problem. The machine was the problem, and the machine couldn't bend. But here's what people who were there actually remember about those years, and it isn't the price of coffee. They remember that the mac and cheese still had the tomatoes. They remember walking in and the nickel thrower was still sitting there, still sliding coins without looking. The room still smelled the same. The chrome was still polished. Mel Brooks said he'd paid $35 for a cup of coffee in Paris, and it wasn't half as good as that nickel Hardart coffee. After the war, America moved to the suburbs. The Automat was built for sidewalks, for foot traffic, for people who walked to lunch. It was not built for highways, parking lots, or drive-through windows. And that commissary system, the one kitchen that made the food perfect everywhere, it only worked when the restaurants were a short truck ride from the kitchen. You can't cook 400 items fresh before dawn and deliver them to locations scattered across 3 states. The system that made the food great was designed for a city that stayed in one place. America didn't stay. McDonald's, Burger King, White Castle. They didn't need a commissary, smaller menus, faster service, and a window you could shout through from the front seat. The Automat couldn't compete with that. And the door, the one that never closed, the one that didn't care who you were or how long you'd been sitting there, that door was still open, still unlocked at midnight, still warm inside. But the sidewalks outside were empty. The people who used to fill those seats after dark had moved somewhere the Automat couldn't follow. The door didn't close. The people just stopped walking through it. If you were a regular during those years, you remember what it looked like. The same room, the same wall, The same glass doors, but half the seats empty at 6 o'clock. Fewer dishes behind the windows at night. It happened so slowly you didn't notice until one day you looked around and the room felt different. Same chrome, same marble, just quieter. And the food that didn't sell still had somewhere to go. The company ran day-old shops in working-class neighborhoods where you could buy yesterday's pies and rolls at a discount. If you grew up in one of those neighborhoods, that's how you know this place. Not the Automat itself, but the day-old shop where your mom went for bread. And it was still good bread. It was just a day late. What the company did next is the part that stings. Not because it's dramatic. Because you can see it coming. By the mid-70s, Horn and Hardart started converting Automats into Burger King franchises. The company that figured out how to feed a city without a single waiter was now paying teenagers to ask if you wanted fries with that. They also bought a mail-order catalog company. Because apparently when your restaurant is dying, the next move is selling bathrobes through the mail. By the mid-80s, Horn and Hardart wasn't a restaurant company anymore. It was just a name. But somewhere in Manhattan, a handful of Automats were still open. Still serving baked beans and coconut custard pie through the same little glass doors. Still taking coins. Still lit up at night. Not many, but still. And even at the very end, the food was the food. That mac and cheese with the tomatoes and the cayenne. The creamed spinach that somehow tasted good even though creamed spinach has absolutely no business tasting good. The date nut bread with cream cheese that one woman said she still dreams about. The coconut custard pie that people described the way other people described their first car. Philadelphia's last Automat closed May 12, 1990. That left one Automat on 42nd Street and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan, open since 1958. On April 9, 1991, they locked the revolving doors 2 hours early. The sign didn't say closed. It said closed for renovation. A radio producer named David Isay was there for NPR. Workmen came in with chisels and pried the machines off the walls. They unscrewed the marble knobs one by one. They pulled down the little brass signs. Kaiser roll with jelly, pot of baked beans, bologna sandwich. An engineer named John Roamis, who'd kept those machines running for about 40 years, helped take them apart, piece by piece. He saved the knobs, the coin slots, the little glass doors, and kept them the rest of his life. People were still sitting at the tables while this was happening. A 97-year-old woman said, "I'm 97 years old. I never missed to come here. It hurts." Another regular said, "I came here 75 years ago. And now they're closing?" And the people who were still inside at the very end were picking up spilled coffee from the table and pouring it back into their cups to make it last just a little bit longer. That building is a Gap store now. When they tore down the original Chestnut Street Automat back in 1969, the interior was donated to the Smithsonian. 35 feet of mirrors, marble, and chrome sitting in the National Museum of American History. Beautiful things behind glass that nobody feeds anymore. Which is kind of the perfect summary of the whole Automat, when you think about it. That's all it ever was. Beautiful things behind glass. In 2021, a documentary came out. Mel Brooks, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Colin Powell, and Carl Reiner are all in it. Brooks wrote an original song for it. Ginsburg said the Automat showed what America could be. 3 of the people in that film died before it was finished. And Howard Schultz, the Starbucks guy, said the Automat shaped his whole idea of what a coffee shop should feel like. He saw what Horn and Hardart saw. He just built a machine that could change its prices and charge you $6 for what used to cost a nickel. But that's a different video. The sign said, closed for renovation. That was 35 years ago. I don't think they're renovating. But for a while there, you could walk in off the street with a handful of nickels and eat like everybody was equal. And that was really something. So were you ever in one? The baked beans, the coconut custard pie, the coffee from the dolphin spout. Maybe your grandmother took you as a treat, and you got peanut butter on raisin bread and a cupcake behind a little glass door, and it felt like the whole world was made of food. Or maybe your mom took you after Radio City at Christmas and the hot cocoa was the best thing you'd ever had. Tell me in the comments. I want to know who still remembers the little glass doors.